The morning air around the airport felt heavy, the kind of heaviness that came from too many people moving in too many directions at the same time. It was one of those travel days when the lines felt longer, the announcements seemed louder, and everyone appeared a little more tired than usual. Among the long line of travelers waiting to board the flight, a woman stood shifting her weight from one foot to the other, staring at the gate with growing impatience. She wasn't a bad person. She simply carried a habit of speaking before thinking, something that had caused her trouble more than once in her life. The people around her kept a little distance, half because of the crowded line and half because she had been muttering her thoughts out loud since she arrived. She talked about how slow the boarding process was, how the airline didn't know how to organize anything, and how today seemed like the kind of day when everything would go wrong. People listened, then looked away, hoping she wouldn't turn her irritation toward them. Near the front of the line, a man stood quietly, hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed. He wasn't trying to draw attention to himself, but something about him made others glance his way. Maybe it was the quiet confidence in the way he stood, or maybe it was the bright red hat he wore. The hat was unmistakable, the kind that sparkled strong opinions, even without a single word spoken. Most people simply glanced at it, took a mental note, and continued minding their own business. But the woman behind him noticed it too, and unlike the others, she didn't hold back her reaction. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she narrowed her eyes, looked him up and down, and gave a small scoff, as if she had just confirmed something she expected all along. Her mood shifted from irritation to frustration, and she began whispering to the person behind her, though the whisper wasn't really a whisper. It was loud enough that the man in the hat could clearly hear her if he wanted to. "Just my luck," she said. "Of all the people I could end up near today, it has to be someone like him." The person behind her didn't respond. They pretended they didn't hear anything, but their tight smile and nervous posture made it clear they wished to be anywhere else. Boarding began shortly after, and the woman continued mumbling to herself as the line moved forward. When she reached the gate, she handed her ticket to the agent, who greeted her with a polite smile. She didn't smile back. Instead, she nodded sharply, grabbed her boarding pass, and stepped into the jet bridge, her eyes already searching for the red hat ahead of her inside the plane. The familiar mix of excitement and discomfort filled the air. People rushed to find their seats, put away their bags, and avoid bumping elbows or blocking the aisle too long. The man with the red hat reached his seat first, an aisle seat on the right side of the cabin. He placed a small bag under the seat in front of him, sat down calmly, and buckled his seatbelt. A few seconds later, the woman appeared beside him, ticket in hand, staring down at the seat number as if the numbers themselves had insulted her. Her lips tightened when she realized her seat was the window seat beside him. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. The man heard her, but he didn't respond. He simply unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up to let her pass. He stepped aside with a polite, almost warm smile, making plenty of room for her. She didn't thank him. She squeezed past with a dramatic sigh, brushing against him as she slid into her seat and dropping her purse onto her lap as if she had been forced into the worst seat on the plane. As he sat back down, he made no comment. He adjusted his hat slightly, leaned back, and rested his hands on the armrests with an easy calmness. She, on the other hand, shifted her body away from him, folding her arms tightly across her chest as if protecting herself from some invisible threat. "This is exactly the kind of experience I didn't want today," she said loudly enough for him and the surrounding passengers to hear. "I don't know why people think it's okay to wear stuff like that on a plane." Still, he remained silent. A few passengers turned their heads, curious, but quickly looked forward again, hoping the tension wouldn't grow into something bigger. A flight attendant approached with a welcoming smile. stopping beside the woman's row. "Good morning," she said gently. "Do you need help storing your bag?" "No," the woman snapped. "I'm fine." The attendant blinked, but kept her pleasant expression. "All right. If you need anything later, just let me know." As the attendant began moving on, the woman raised her voice again. "Actually," she said, "can I be moved? I don't want to sit here." The attendant paused, confused. "Is something wrong with the seat?" The woman didn't look at her. She kept her eyes fixed on the man beside her. "It's not the seat. It's the company." The attendant followed her gaze and understood instantly. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I'm afraid the flight is full today," she explained. "We may not have any open seats, but I can check after everyone finishes boarding." The woman crossed her arms again. "Figures." The man still didn't react. His silence didn't come from avoidance or guilt. It simply looked like he didn't want to escalate things. His calmness only frustrated her more, though she didn't admit that to herself. Instead, she muttered under her breath, creating an uncomfortable bubble that made the passengers in the nearby rows shift and pull out their phones. Pretending not to listen, the boarding process continued. People squeezed through the aisle, placing suitcases overhead and greeting their seatmates. A family with 2 young kids settled a few rows ahead, the children pressing their faces against the airplane window with excitement. A couple across the aisle quietly discussed their vacation plans. The crew moved up and down the cabin, offering help, guiding passengers, and preparing the cabin for departure. But the tension in the woman's row lingered like a small storm cloud. She tapped her fingers impatiently on her armrest. The man casually opened a book he had brought with him, flipping to the first page with a relaxed expression. His calmness didn't mean he didn't know what was happening. He simply chose not to react, something that only made her more certain of her own assumptions. She watched him for a moment, her eyes drifting between his hat and his face. She was ready to believe everything she wanted to believe about him without knowing anything at all. She didn't know where he came from, what he believed in, or what kind of person he truly was. She only saw a hat, and in her mind, that was enough to form a complete picture. Another flight attendant passed by, greeting the man with a familiar nod. There was something warm in the way she looked at him, something respectful. It wasn't a nod given to every passenger, and the woman noticed it immediately. The realization annoyed her even more. "Oh, I see," she whispered sarcastically. "Of course." Soon, the captain's voice filled the cabin, welcoming everyone aboard and giving the usual safety instructions. Engines hummed, overhead bins clicked shut, seatbelts tightened, and the plane prepared to move away from the gate. The woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at the man again. He turned a page in his book, completely unaffected by her presence. Something about his calmness unsettled her. Maybe deep down, she expected a reaction, an argument, a comment, some kind of fight that would justify the frustration she felt. But his polite silence made her feel strangely exposed, as if she was the only one creating tension while he remained. Steady and UNBOTHERED as the plane began rolling toward the runway. She sighed loudly and leaned back in her seat. "This is going to be a long flight," she said. For the first time, the man looked at her. Not with anger, not with judgment, just a soft, patient expression that carried a calm she didn't understand. "It doesn't have to be," he said gently. He turned back to his book. His voice was calm, steady, and so unexpectedly kind that it left her momentarily speechless. She wasn't ready to hear gentleness from someone she had already decided she disliked. For a moment, she sat still, trying to make sense of the feeling in her chest, something between guilt and embarrassment, though she wasn't ready to call it that yet. The engines roared softly as the plane lifted off the ground, carrying every passenger high above the earth. Some were excited, Some were tired, some were nervous, and some were just hoping for a smooth flight. But in the middle of row 14, two people sat side by side, one holding on to a pile of assumptions, and the other holding on to quiet patience. Neither of them knew yet how much the next few hours would change the way they saw each other, or themselves. But the first seeds of that change were already planted, even if neither could feel it yet. The plane leveled in the sky with a smooth shift that made a few passengers grip their armrests. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, giving the space a softer glow. People settled in quietly, some pulling out headphones, others staring out the window, and a few already drifting toward sleep. But in row 14, the air still felt tight, as if the conversation that never happened was pressing against both passengers. The woman sat stiffly against the window, her arms still crossed, but not as tightly as before. She peeked at the man beside her from the corner of her eye. He hadn't looked up from his book since takeoff, nor had he made any move to respond to her earlier comments. His calmness bothered her more now that the plane had reached cruising altitude. She wondered if he truly didn't care about the tension, or if he simply chose not to acknowledge it. She wasn't used to people responding to her frustration with quiet patience. Usually, her sharp words led to arguments. Most people pushed back, or at least met her tone. But this man didn't. Instead, he acted like the small moments of conflict hadn't happened at all. After several minutes of silence, she shifted in her seat and pressed the window shade halfway down. She glanced at him again, still annoyed that he wouldn't react. The truth was, she wasn't angry at him. She was angry at herself, angry at the long, stressful morning, angry at the rush drive to the airport, angry at the security line where she lost her patience, angry at the delayed boarding announcement she didn't understand, and angry at the feeling that no matter what she did, life seemed to throw something difficult her way. Seeing him wearing something that reminded her of a world she didn't agree with had been the easy thing to lash out at. She didn't know that yet, but the frustration had built up long before she reached her seat beside him. The flight attendant from earlier returned, walking row by row with a tray of water cups. Her smile remained warm and professional, even as she approached row 14. "Water for you?" she asked. The woman took one without saying thank you. She raised it immediately and drank half in one sip, like someone trying to relax but failing. The man beside her accepted a cup with a polite nod. As the attendant moved away, the woman lifted her cup again, but her hand wasn't steady. A small splash of water spilled onto her shirt. She let out a frustrated sigh, wiping the spot with her sleeve. The man turned slightly toward her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She didn't respond right away. She didn't want help from him, yet she also wasn't used to people checking on her with genuine concern. After a moment, she said, "I'm fine," though her voice held more exhaustion than irritation. He nodded and turned back to his book, not pushing further. She expected him to say more, maybe something smug or self-righteous, but he didn't. Somehow, that made her feel even more uneasy. She almost wished he would say something to spark an argument, something she could defend herself against. But instead, he gave her nothing to fight. Minutes passed. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them. The woman stared at the seat in front of her, thinking about things she had tried not to think about. She wasn't usually reflective. She wasn't someone who paused to understand her own emotions. But something about this moment made her feel the weight of her own behavior. "So you're just going to sit there and pretend nothing happened?" she finally muttered without looking at him. He slowly closed his book, marking the page with his finger. "I'm not pretending," he said gently. "I just didn't think you needed me to respond." She scoffed. Most people would argue back. He nodded. "Maybe, but not everything needs an argument." She laughed under her breath, a short, tired sound. "You don't know me." "No," he said softly. "I don't." His answer surprised her. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that. Not defensively, not sarcastically, just honest and calm. "But you judged me pretty quickly," he added, meeting her eyes briefly. Her face tightened. She was ready to deny it, ready to justify herself, but something inside her stopped the words. She looked away instead. The truth stung in a way she didn't expect. "I just don't like things like that," she said, glancing at his hat, but not pointing at it. "I understand," he replied. "It brings out strong reactions." The easy acceptance in his voice confused her. She waited for him to defend himself, but he didn't. "You wear it to make people react?" she asked sharply. "Not exactly," he said with a small shrug. "I wear it because it reminds me of something personal, not political." That caught her off guard. "Personal?" she repeated. "Yes," he replied, though he didn't explain further. She wasn't sure how to respond. Her frustration wasn't disappearing, but it was shifting, changing shape into something less sharp, something she couldn't quite identify. Another flight attendant approached, this one different from the first. He wore a kind smile but held a clipboard, marking details as he walked. When he reached their row, he paused. His eyes softened when he saw the man. "It's good to have you with us again," the attendant said in a low voice meant only for him. The woman blinked. She looked between the attendant and the man beside her. "Again?" she asked, unable to stop herself. The attendant quickly smiled at her too, not wanting to make things awkward. "He travels with us often," he said politely. "We appreciate passengers who treat our crew kindly." The woman heard the subtext. He was someone the airline valued. She didn't know what that meant yet, but her curiosity sharpened as the attendant left. She leaned slightly toward the man. "Do you work for the airline?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "No," he said simply, opening his book again, but not reading. She waited for him to continue, but he didn't. He didn't seem bothered by the question. He just wasn't in a rush to explain himself. "So why do the attendants act like they know you?" She pushed. He smiled a calm, steady smile that felt almost too patient. "Maybe I'm just friendly." She stared at him, unsure if he was joking or being honest. She couldn't tell, and that annoyed her even more because she wasn't used to people she couldn't read easily. A small child from a few rows ahead suddenly cried, breaking the tension. The crying grew louder, the child kicking his seat and calling out for his mother. Flight attendants rushed to help, offering snacks and toys, but the child was too overwhelmed. His mother tried to calm him, whispering softly, but nothing worked. The woman in row 14 closed her eyes, clearly irritated. "Wonderful," she muttered. "This day just keeps getting better." The man didn't complain. Instead, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. The woman watched him with confusion as he walked to the child's row. He knelt down gently beside the mother and spoke to the child in a soft voice she couldn't hear. Whatever he said must have been comforting, because the child slowly stopped crying and began to sniff quietly. The mother looked relieved, thanking him with a grateful smile. He returned to his seat calmly. "You know the kid?" The woman asked, surprised. "No," he said. "Just trying to help." She didn't understand him. She didn't understand how someone could remain so calm, so patient, especially after she had behaved the way she had before takeoff. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. He looked at her, puzzled. "Why what?" "Why help? You don't owe anyone anything." He thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes it's not about owing," he said. "It's just about being human." The answer hit something deep inside her, something uncomfortable, something she wasn't ready to examine. The rest of the cabin seemed to settle again. People returned to their conversations, their screens, their books. The engines hummed smoothly beneath the floor, creating a steady rhythm in the background. But in row 14, the quiet between the two passengers wasn't the same anymore. The tension still lingered, but it had softened. The woman kept looking at him, not with anger now, but with curiosity. She tried to hide, but not very well. She leaned back against her seat and looked out the window, even though the shade was halfway down. She wasn't looking at the clouds. She was looking at her reflection, at the expression on her face, at the way her own behavior appeared to her now. She had expected him to be rude. She had expected him to argue. She had expected him to be the kind of person she believed he was the moment. She saw his hat, but nothing he did matched her assumptions. And that left her with one unsettling truth. The only person who had been unfair so far was her. She wasn't ready to admit it aloud. Not yet. But the thought settled quietly in her chest like a stone, and the flight was far from over. The plane moved steadily through the sky as the hours passed, though time felt slower to the woman sitting beside the man with the red hat. She stared at the back of the seat in front of her, pretending to be focused on the small safety card she had pulled out earlier. But her mind wasn't on the words or the pictures. Her mind was circling everything that had happened so far, piecing together moments she didn't want to admit mattered to her. The man beside her had gone back to reading, or at least he appeared to be reading. Every now and then he paused on the same line longer than normal, which made her think he might be aware of her glancing at him. If he noticed, he didn't show it. He sat calmly, breathing quietly, turning pages with gentle movements. She wished she could feel that calm. But instead, she felt something she wasn't used to feeling: unsettled, embarrassed, confused, and strangely curious all at once. The morning's irritation had faded, but it left behind a strange tension inside her, as if she needed to say something, but couldn't find the right words. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, and a flight attendant made an announcement about turbulence expected ahead. People fastened their seatbelts, checked their trays, and adjusted their things. The woman did the same, but with a bit more nervousness. Flying had never been her favorite thing. She didn't like heights, and she didn't like the idea of being stuck in the sky with no control. She pulled the seatbelt tighter around her waist, but the man noticed. "Are you nervous?" he asked in that same gentle tone he had used before. She wasn't used to people noticing her feelings. Usually, when she was upset or scared, her frustration came out instead. But he didn't sound like he was judging her. He sounded like he genuinely wanted to know. She looked at him briefly, then away. "I don't like turbulence," she admitted. "Most people don't," he said. "But this airline is good. They handle it well." She knew he didn't mean to brag, but something in the way he said, "this airline," made her remember the attendant's respectful tone toward him earlier. There was still something about him she didn't understand. The plane shook lightly, a soft bump at first. A few passengers gasped. The woman took a slow breath, trying to hide the way her stomach tightened. Her hands gripped the armrests without her realizing it. "It'll pass," the man said calmly, keeping his voice steady in a way that made her heartbeat slow down. "This part of the route always has a few bumps." She gave him a small sideways glance. "You fly this route a lot?" "Quite a bit," he said. "You start to recognize patterns after a while." She wondered again if he worked for the airline in some important way, or if he was just someone who traveled often enough that the crew knew him. Either way, the calm in his voice was steady and believable. She found herself listening to him, even though she didn't want to admit it. The turbulence grew stronger. The plane bounced slightly, shaking just enough to make a few people gasp again. Someone toward the back whispered something in fear. A teenager across the aisle gripped the armrest like it was glued to his hand. The woman shut her eyes, her breath uneven. The man noticed again. He didn't reach for her hand or break any personal boundaries. He simply spoke with a softness that made the moment feel less frightening. "Try to breathe slowly," he said. "The bumps may feel big, but the plane is stable. It's built for much worse than this." She opened her eyes halfway and looked at him. His expression was calm and steady, not forced or fake. There wasn't even a hint of fear. Somehow, that helped her feel grounded that the turbulence eventually softened. The shaking slowed until it was barely noticeable. People loosened their grips and leaned back in their seats again. She let out a long breath she didn't realize she had been holding. A small laugh came out with it, a nervous kind of laugh. "I hate this part," she muttered. "Understandable," he replied. "You handled it well." She scoffed. "No, I didn't. I looked like a scared kid." "There's nothing wrong with being scared," he said gently. "Fear is human. How we treat others when we're scared, that's what matters." The words hit something inside her again. She knew she hadn't treated anyone kindly earlier. Not him, not the crew, not even the people around her who had done nothing at all. She stared at her hands for a few seconds, quietly picking at her nails. "You must think I'm awful," she finally said. "No," he replied quickly. "I don't think that?" "You should," she said, an unexpected sadness in her voice. "I snapped at everyone today, and I judged you the moment I saw you." He offered a small, understanding smile. "We all have days like that." She wanted to push back, argue, or defend herself, but she couldn't. Something about the calm truth in his voice made it impossible. She sank back into her seat, thinking about how rare it was for someone to treat her with understanding instead of anger. The cabin grew quieter as people settled again. The snack service began shortly after, and the attendants came row by row with carts of small packages. The woman wasn't very hungry, but she took a snack bag anyway. When the attendant reached their row, she gave the man an extra warm smile. He thanked her politely, but once again there was something familiar in the way she looked at him. Something respectful. Not romantic, not flirtatious, just deeply respectful, like she knew something about him no one else did. "You really must fly often," the woman said after the attendant walked away. He chuckled lightly. "You could say that. Are you some kind of VIP passenger or something?" She asked. "Not exactly," he replied, the same way he had earlier. She leaned her head slightly toward him. "But they all know you." He shrugged softly. "I've spent a lot of time with them." "You get to know people when you see them often." His answer was honest, but something about it still felt like it wasn't the whole story. Not a lie, but not the complete truth either. That bothered her even more, because curiosity had now replaced her earlier frustration. The plane shook gently again, but this time it was mild, nothing like before. Still, she grabbed the armrest out of habit. When she noticed him looking, she quickly pulled her hand back, embarrassed. "You don't have to pretend you're not scared," he said kindly. "It's all right." She sighed. "I just don't like feeling helpless." The man nodded as if he understood that feeling deeply. "Most people don't," he said softly. She turned her body slightly toward him. "Do you ever get scared?" He looked out the window thoughtfully before answering. "Of course. Fear is part of life." The answer surprised her again. He didn't seem like someone who admitted things like that easily. But maybe that was because she had already made up her mind about him before she knew anything about him. "And what do you do when you're scared?" she asked quietly. "I try to stay calm," he said. "And I remind myself that not everything I fear is dangerous. Sometimes fear just comes from not knowing the whole story." She froze for a second. She knew that wasn't just about turbulence. She knew he was talking about her earlier reactions too. She swallowed. Her voice softened without her choosing it. I shouldn't have said those things earlier. He looked at her gently. It's okay. No, she insisted. It's not. I judged you? I judged you before you even said a word. He nodded slowly. You did. She opened her mouth to apologize, but hesitated. She didn't know how to apologize without sounding awkward or dramatic. She wasn't used to apologizing in general. Most of the time, she walked away from conflict and pretended it never happened. He sensed her struggle and didn't push her. You don't have to explain anything, he said. We're strangers on a flight. People make quick assumptions sometimes. She shook her head. You're being too understanding. He laughed softly, not mocking but warm. And you're being too hard on yourself. The plane grew quieter again, and for the first time since she sat down, she felt a tiny sense of peace. It wasn't full comfort yet, but it was a start. She looked out the window and noticed the soft golden glow of sunlight touching the clouds like a thin blanket. It felt calming. A few minutes later, the senior crew member, the one who had recognized him earlier, walked past their row. He paused briefly and lowered his voice. Everything all right here? He asked the man politely. Yes, the man said with a smile. All good. The woman watched closely. The crew member nodded respectfully, then continued down the aisle. The interaction lasted only a second, but it made her curiosity grow stronger. Okay, what was that? She asked once the crew member was out of earshot. Why do they talk to you like that? Like you're someone important? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her expression, as if deciding whether she was ready to hear the truth or whether telling her now would make the situation awkward. I'll tell you later, he said finally. Later? She repeated, confused. Why later? Because right now, you're still trying to understand yourself, he said gently. It wouldn't make sense yet. She stared at him, unsure whether to be annoyed or intrigued. But deep down, she felt a shift, an unexpected one. Slowly, quietly, something inside her was changing. Her anger had softened. Her assumptions had cracked. And her curiosity had begun to pull her into a place she didn't expect to be. The flight still had far to go. And something told her the moment she discovered the truth about him, everything she thought she knew about this day, and herself would change forever. The plane kept moving across the sky, the clouds passing under them like slow waves. Most passengers were resting or quietly watching movies. The cabin lights had been dimmed, and there was a calm that felt completely different from the tension earlier. Yet the mood hadn't fully settled for the woman who had caused the scene. She kept glancing toward the aisle where the flight attendant stood, talking in a low voice with the man in the red hat. She couldn't hear what they were saying. But every time the man nodded or gave a small smile, she felt something inside her twist. Earlier she had spoken loudly, sure of herself, sure that she was right, sure that she was standing up for something important. But now all that confidence had faded, and what replaced it was a mix of embarrassment and confusion. She didn't quite understand. The man in the hat wasn't acting the way she expected. He wasn't offended. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to get her punished. He wasn't even avoiding her. In fact, after the flight attendant walked away, he quietly returned to his seat and simply opened a small notebook, as if nothing had happened. She didn't like not knowing what to think. She was used to believing she could read people in a second. She believed she understood who they were and what they stood for just by looking at them. But something about this situation felt different. It wasn't meeting her expectations. It wasn't giving her the reaction she wanted, even the reaction she thought she deserved down the aisle. The flight attendant returned with a small tray for him, a cup of hot tea, a warm towel, and a small plate with some fruit. It didn't look like standard service. She noticed it right away. Her eyes narrowed, not out of anger this time, but because something was strange. The flight attendant bent toward him with more respect than usual, saying something quietly. The man nodded, thanked her, and continued writing in his notebook. His pen moved slowly, like he had all the time in the world. She watched even more closely now. The woman next to her seemed to sense her confusion and whispered, "You okay?" She forced a small smile. Yes, just tired. But she wasn't tired. She was restless. And she couldn't shake the feeling that she had misjudged something, maybe everything. She had spent most of her life believing she could speak her mind freely and that her opinions were always justified. She didn't consider herself rude. She considered herself direct. She didn't consider herself unfair. She believed she was simply pointing out what others were too scared to say. She didn't even think she had done anything wrong earlier. She believed she had stood up for what mattered. But now, as she watched the man quietly sip his tea without even looking her way, she felt something she hadn't expected. It was almost like disappointment in herself. She tried distracting herself by scrolling through her phone, but the screen only reflected her own unsettled expression. She closed it again and looked around the cabin, letting her eyes settle on the passengers who had witnessed her outburst. Some were asleep. Some were wearing headphones. Others were talking softly with their seat partners. No one was staring at her, but she felt exposed anyway. Her mind went back to the moment when she had raised her voice, pointing at the red hat and saying it made her uncomfortable. She remembered how certain she felt in that moment. She remembered expecting the flight crew to back her up. She remembered believing the man would be told off or moved. She remembered feeling powerful. Now she just felt unsure. After a while, the man closed his notebook and stood up. He stretched his arms a little before stepping into the aisle. She expected him to walk toward the restroom, but instead he moved toward the back of the plane. She watched him the entire time, curiosity growing stronger than her pride. At the back of the plane, one of the younger crew members greeted him with a warm smile. They talked softly, but she couldn't hear a word. The young attendant looked nervous at first, then deeply respectful. She even bowed her head slightly, as if speaking to someone important. It was such a strange sight that it made the woman straighten in her seat. She had flown with this airline many times. She had never seen the crew behave that way toward a passenger. He wasn't loud. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't showing off. And that made it even stranger. He stayed at the back for a few minutes, seeming to check something on a tablet the attendant handed him. Again, it didn't look like anything a regular passenger would be allowed to do. They were discussing cabin comfort, seat numbers, service timing. It almost looked like a staff meeting. She frowned, trying to piece it together. Something wasn't adding up. And the man nodded one last time, handed back the tablet with a friendly smile, and made his way back up the aisle. As he approached her row, she froze. She didn't want him to see the confusion on her face. She didn't want him to notice how intently she had been observing him. So she shifted slightly, pretending to adjust her seatbelt, but she could still sense him walking past. He didn't look at her. Not even for a second. Strangely, that bothered her more than if he had confronted her. Because if he wasn't angry, and he wasn't offended, and he wasn't avoiding her, then what was he? She spent several minutes trying to calm her thoughts. The engine's steady hum filled the silence around her. She tapped her fingers on her lap, took a deep breath, and tried to let it go. But her mind kept drifting back to him. Who drinks tea like that after being yelled at? Who gets special treatment from the crew without asking? Who checks service details on a staff tablet? Who stays calm through everything? The questions kept multiplying. Then, as if reading her growing confusion, the older man who had helped calm her earlier, a gentle passenger seated across the aisle, leaned forward, slightly, and whispered, "You seem troubled." She felt embarrassed to admit it, but she nodded, "Do you know him?" she asked quietly. The older man shook his head. "Not personally, but I've seen him before." Her brows rose. "Where?" The older man gave a small, knowing smile. "On flights. More than once. And the crew always treats him a little differently." "Why?" she asked quickly. He shrugged lightly. "Not my place to say. But I can tell you this, he's not who you think he is." She felt her stomach turn. "Who is he then?" The older man only smiled again, gentle but firm. "You'll find out soon enough." She swallowed, unsure how to respond. His tone wasn't mysterious on purpose. It was more like he genuinely knew something she didn't, and he didn't want to ruin a moment that wasn't his to reveal. She sat back, her heartbeat a little faster now. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, the quiet heavier. She wasn't used to being the last one to understand. Something she wasn't used to being. The one who misjudged a situation. And she definitely wasn't used to being the one who might have spoken too soon. The man in the red hat returned to his seat as calmly as he had left it. He placed his notebook away, adjusted his seat slightly, and looked out the window. The soft light from outside reflected off his face, making him look peaceful, almost thoughtful. She stared at him for a long moment, and for the first time since the confrontation, she wondered if the story she had built in her mind about him was completely wrong. The plane continued forward, cutting through the clouds, and somewhere between the quiet of the cabin and the beating of her own heart, she felt something shift inside her, a realization she wasn't ready to face, but one she could no longer avoid. Everything she thought she knew about him, everything she believed about the situation, everything she assumed, it might all be untrue. And deep down, she sensed that the truth, whatever it was going to change the rest of his flight, maybe even more than that. The rest of the flight settled into a strange quiet, the kind that made every small sound feel louder. The woman shifted in her seat, her thoughts looping endlessly. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important, something right in front of her that she hadn't noticed because she had been too busy judging Dot for a long time. She kept trying to glance at the man discreetly. He was calm, writing in his notebook again. At one point he paused, closed his eyes for a moment, and breathed in slowly. He looked like someone who had lived many lives, not just one. Someone who had learned the value of silence. Someone who didn't waste energy being angry. That unsettled her more than anything else. She found herself replaying the moment when she raised her voice at him. She had felt justified then. She had convinced herself she was protecting the comfort of everyone around her. Now she wondered if she had only been protecting her own assumptions. She also kept remembering how the crew acted around him, the respectful tone, the quiet discussions, the small privileges she'd never seen given to regular passengers, and the way the older man across the aisle had spoken almost knowingly. All of it created a picture that didn't match her original view of the man in the red hat. She leaned back against her seat and closed her eyes, trying to relax. She didn't want to admit it, but she felt embarrassed. She didn't like being wrong. She didn't like feeling small or confused. She didn't like not understanding a situation she thought she controlled. She wasn't used to apologizing. She wasn't even sure she knew how to apologize in a way that felt real. As she tried to settle her thoughts, a small turbulence shook the plane. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to make everyone lift their heads. The seatbelt sign flashed on, and a voice from the cockpit calmly asked everyone to remain seated. A few passengers tightened their belts. A young child started to cry softly. The man in the red hat looked up, checked the aisle instinctively, and then relaxed again. The crew moved quickly but calmly. Something about their confidence made everyone else feel safe. The turbulence passed after a few moments, but the brief shake of the cabin seemed to stir something inside her. She felt a sudden rush of guilt, as if the confusion in her head had finally caught up to her heart. She took a slow breath and looked at the man again. He was flipping through his notebook, maybe reviewing something he had written earlier. She watched the movement of his hand steady, deliberate. Not a single sign of impatience. It pushed her to make a decision she had been avoiding since Narration. Confrontation. She needed to speak to him. Not to prove anything. Not to defend herself. But because something inside her told her that if she didn't face this moment, she would carry the regret much longer than she wanted to. She waited until the seatbelt sign turned off. The crew began moving through the cabin again, and conversations around her resumed in quiet tones. She swallowed hard, feeling her pulse quicken. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt. Her legs felt heavy as she stood, like they were protesting. She rehearsed words in her mind, but none of them felt right. Every sentence felt too weak or too complicated. She wasn't used to humbling herself. She wasn't used to approaching someone she had judged so harshly, but she took a small step forward, then another. She moved slowly down the aisle until she stood next to his row. He was so focused on what he was writing that he didn't even notice her. Unsure how to start, she lightly tapped the top of the seat in front of him. He looked up, his expression calm, almost welcoming. "Hi," she said quietly. He nodded with a small smile. "Hello." For a moment, she couldn't find her voice. She felt the eyes of other passengers on her, not many, but enough to make her palms sweat. She finally forced herself to speak. "I wanted to say something." He gently closed his notebook, giving her his full attention. "Of course." She breathed in slowly and sat down on the edge of the armrest near the aisle. "Earlier, when I spoke the way I did, I was wrong." Her voice cracked, not from sadness, but from the weight of the words she wasn't used to saying. "I judged you. I spoke too fast. I didn't think. And I'm sorry." He didn't react immediately. He simply watched her with patient eyes, the kind that made her feel seen in a way that felt both uncomfortable and relieving at the same time. After a quiet moment, he nodded. "Thank you for saying that." She blinked, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. She had expected something else, maybe a lecture, maybe a polite dismissal, maybe even an uncomfortable silence. But he accepted her apology as though it was the simplest thing in the world. It almost made her emotional. She cleared her throat. "I just wanted you to know. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable or disrespect you." He smiled softly. "You didn't make me uncomfortable." She tensed. "I didn't?" "No," he said calmly. "People react to things differently. Sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of misunderstanding. It happens. I don't take it personally." "But you should have," she whispered. He shook his head lightly. "No, life is too short to hold on to moments like that." His words felt like a quiet lesson, one she hadn't asked for, but somehow needed. She hesitated, then asked in a low voice, "Can I ask you something?" He nodded again. "You can." "Who are you?" He laughed gently, though not in a mocking way. "Just someone trying to get home." She felt her cheeks warm. He wasn't going to make it easy for her. She tried again. "I noticed the way the crew talks to you, the way they bring things to you, the way they act. It's not normal." He looked thoughtful for a moment, as if considering how much he should say. Then he leaned back slightly and replied, "I've worked with this airline for a long time." She stiffened. "You work for the airline?" "In a way," he said. Her mind raced. Was he a consultant? A safety inspector? Someone who trained the crew? But before she could ask more, the young flight attendant who had spoken to him earlier appeared behind her. "Sir, we'll be ready whenever you want us to prepare the cabin." She froze. Her eyes widened. The words didn't make sense at first, but then they did, the way the crew treated him. The tablet, the meetings at the back of the plane, the confidence, the calm, the silence, the kindness, the authority he didn't need to announce. He wasn't just an employee. He was something more. The woman looked at the man slowly, her breathing shallow. But he only smiled gently, as if none of it mattered. "I don't like special attention," he said quietly. "I prefer blending in when I travel." She swallowed. "You? You're the owner, aren't you?" He didn't answer directly, but the flight attendant bowed her head slightly, confirming everything without saying a single word. The woman felt her stomach drop. Her apology suddenly felt more necessary than ever, but now also painfully small. He noticed the panic in her eyes and shook his head softly. "It doesn't change anything," he said. "You apologized. That's more than most people do." She stared at him, speechless. Her throat tightened with emotions she couldn't name: shame, relief, disbelief, gratitude. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then he nodded gently. "You did the right thing by coming here." She nodded slowly, feeling overwhelmed. I didn't know. You weren't supposed to know," he cut in with a warm smile. And it wouldn't have changed anything. The honesty in his voice settled something inside her, like a weight being lifted and replaced with clarity. "I just hope," he added, "that the next time you meet someone who looks different from what you expect, you give them a moment before judging." She lowered her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "I will." He smiled again, soft and real. Then this moment was worth it. She stood slowly, feeling humbled in a way she had never experienced. She nodded once more, turned and walked back to her seat. Her steps were shaky, her chest warm, her mind filled with thoughts she was still processing. When she sat down again, she didn't look around. She didn't need to. She simply closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting everything sink in all her years of flying, all her arguments, all her opinions. She had never met someone like him. Someone powerful who didn't need to act powerful. Someone important who didn't need to show it. Someone who chose kindness instead of ego. And she knew, without needing anyone to tell her, that this moment would stay with her long after the plane landed. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the people we judge the most. And sometimes the real truth is simple. You never know who someone really is until life makes you look again. The plane continued gliding through the sky, gently humming as it made its way toward the city lights far below. The woman sat completely still, her hands resting on her lap, her thoughts settling like snow after a long storm. She kept replaying her conversation with the man in the red hat, every word of it, every expression he gave. Every moment he remained calm. She had apologized with her heart in her throat. She had braced herself for a cold response. Instead, she received kindness. A type of kindness she wasn't used to receiving, especially in moments when she knew she didn't deserve it. It was strange to her. Strange, but somehow comforting. The crew moved through the aisle now, but their steps felt lighter, as if the entire atmosphere of the plane had shifted. Even the other passengers sensed something had changed, though they couldn't quite explain what. The earlier tension had dissolved, leaving behind something softer, something that made the entire cabin feel warmer. The older man across the aisle caught her eye again and offered a gentle smile. It didn't feel like judgment. It didn't feel like pity. It felt more like understanding. She wasn't used to that either. She looked out the window. The clouds had parted, revealing a shining patch of land below. Small clusters of lights glowed like tiny stars. She wondered how many people down there were going about their lives, thinking they understood someone just by looking at them. She wondered how many times she had done the same dot. Her heart felt heavy, but not in a painful way. It felt heavy in the way that comes right before clarity. A soft announcement came from the cockpit, saying they would begin their descent soon. People stretched, adjusted their seats, and prepared themselves. The woman straightened her posture, feeling a strange mix of nerves and calmness. She wasn't sure why she felt emotional again. Maybe because the flight was ending. Maybe because she didn't know if she would ever see the man again. Maybe because she wanted to hold on to the lesson she just learned. As the plane dipped slightly, the man in the red hat closed his notebook for the final time and placed it carefully in his bag. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't trying to stand out. He wasn't trying to be admired. He just existed with a kind of quiet honesty she wished more people had, including herself. She watched him for a moment, just long enough to study the calm in his expression. Then she looked away quickly, not wanting to make the moment awkward. But deep down, she knew she would remember that look for a long time. The cabin slowly brightened as the crew prepared for landing. The young attendant who had spoken to the man earlier moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts, securing trays, and making sure everything was set. When she reached the man's row, she paused for a second, nodded respectfully, and whispered something too quiet for others to hear. The man nodded back with a soft, comforting expression, almost like a teacher encouraging a student. The woman watched quietly, her chest tightening. She felt like she was witnessing a different world, a world she had ignored before, because she was too busy reacting instead of understanding. She tightened her seatbelt as the plane descended. The engines hummed louder as they prepared to land. The cabin lights dimmed once more, and the world outside the window turned into a blur of lights and shapes. As the wheels touched down with a gentle thump, a small wave of relief went through the passengers. The crew smiled, passengers clapped softly, and the plane slowly rolled toward the gate. The woman exhaled deeply, her shoulders loosening. It felt like more than just the end of a flight. It felt like the end of something inside her that needed to change. When the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign switched off, passengers stood up, stretching and gathering their bags. The aisle quickly filled with people eager to leave. But the woman remained seated for a few moments. She needed a moment to let everything settle, to breathe, to think, to make sure she wouldn't slip back into her old habits the moment she walked out. The man in the red hat stood slowly, taking his bag from the overhead bin without any rush. He didn't act as if he needed to exit first, even though the crew was subtly giving him space to move if he wanted. He simply waited, letting others go ahead. She admired that. It was rare to see someone with power choose patience over privilege. When it was finally her turn to stand, she did so carefully. She could feel her heartbeat pick up again. Something inside her whispered that this was her last chance to speak to him, to say something more, something honest, something human. She stepped into the aisle and found herself right behind him. He noticed her, smiled softly, and nodded once in greeting. She nodded back, feeling a warmth she didn't expect as they moved slowly toward the exit. She found the courage to speak again. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quietly. He turned slightly, listening. "Not just for accepting my apology," she continued, "but for the way you handled everything. Most people would have reacted differently. I don't think I'll forget it." His expression softened. "You're welcome," he said simply. "And thank you for taking a moment to reflect. Not everyone does." Those words touched her deeper than she expected. They reached the front of the plane, where 2 crew members waited. The captain was there too, standing just outside the cockpit door with a proud, welcoming smile. As the man stepped forward, the captain shook his hand with familiarity and genuine respect. "Good to have you back on board." "Sir?" the captain said. The woman heard it clearly. Not loudly, but clearly enough that the man nodded. It was a good flight. You all did well. The captain smiled like a student being praised by a teacher. Thank you. We try our best. When the man finally stepped out of the plane, the crew straightened their posture a little. It was obvious he wasn't just a guest, he was someone who helped shape the entire airline, someone who carried responsibility without using it to raise his voice, someone who believed in quiet leadership rather than loud authority. The woman stepped to the exit next. The young attendant from earlier paused, looking at her with a gentle expression. It wasn't judgment. It wasn't pity. It was something else, understanding mixed with relief. You did the right thing, the attendant whispered. The woman blinked. Thank you. She stepped out into the jet bridge, breathing air that felt cooler and freer than when she had boarded. People rushed around her, eager to meet loved ones, catch connecting flights, or get to their next destination. But she walked slower than everyone else, lost in her thoughts. As she reached the main terminal, she spotted the man one last time. He wasn't surrounded by assistants or guards. He wasn't being escorted. He wasn't trying to draw attention to himself. He simply walked calmly toward a private door where a quiet, respectful staff member greeted him. Before he entered, he turned slightly, as if sensing her gaze. Their eyes met for a brief moment. He offered one last warm smile, not one of superiority, but of simple humanity. Then he walked through the door and disappeared from view. She stood there for a long moment. It wasn't the kind of story she would brag about. It wasn't the kind she would tell with pride. But it was the kind she would remember every time she felt the urge to judge too quickly, to speak too soon, or to assume too much from too little. She understood now that people were more complicated than labels or appearances. They were full of histories, struggles, strengths, and stories she couldn't see with a single glance. And she understood something even more important. The world doesn't get better by being louder. It gets better when people choose to see each other, really see each other. Before reacting, as she walked toward the baggage area, she felt a quiet shift inside herself, a change she knew wasn't temporary. She didn't need anyone to tell her what to do next. She already knew. Tomorrow, and every day after, she would try to be slower to judge and quicker to understand. She would try to think before speaking. She would try to listen before assuming. She would try to treat people not based on what she believed about them, but based on the humanity they carried, and she hoped, in a small but meaningful way, that made her a better version of herself, because sometimes it takes meeting someone unexpected, someone calm, someone kind, someone who doesn't fit the story we built in our mind, to change the way we see the world. And sometimes all it takes to grow is one quiet lesson at 35,000 feet.